only way you can get the message across. So the first patient that we put on this therapy, she had cardiovascular disease, HFpEF, she had severe osteoarthritis, obstructive sleep apnea, and she was morbidly obese. It was a lot of hand holding, and this is starting from the times of Rybelsus. There was a lot of hand holding because the patient was very upset with the GI symptoms, but we kind of braved all her choicest invectives which she hurled at us. And then she eventually, over a period of 8 months, she was down 24 kilos, and her sleep apnea, her AHI and she was not willing to take a CPAP machine, but on testing, her AHI dropped from 26 to 6, which is great. She not just fit into new clothes, but her ambulation and her exercise. She joined the gym. Her exercise improved, and I think that was what encouraged us to continue with this therapy. We have many patients who've lost more than 25 kilos with either of the two drugs. There are subtle nuance differences between the two, but they have a lot of patients. We had nothing to offer them in HFpEF other than maybe a mix and match kind of thing and maybe some SGLT2 inhibition. But now we have good agents which are available.
I have one comment on this, that not only semaglutide but other GLP receptor agonists will also have the similar effect.
True that.
Because it is not only weight related, it is beyond weight. So
GLP
receptor agonist therapy, whatever the base of the GLP receptor therapy, that will be effective at least in preventing some of the cardiovascular events.
We hope so.
Another important that if we use the GLP receptor agonist along with GIP also, I think that will be more effective, because 70% of the weight is regulated by GIP, not by GLP.
GIP is a very controversial molecule. So just because one company, and we are going to have a presentation on that, has got a GIP agonist, there is another company which has got a GIP antagonist. Amgen is producing a molecule with a GLP-1 receptor.
GLP antagonist may not have the same effect.
But they are showing that to be relevant in clinical trials. Okay, so GIP is a little controversial. GLP-1 receptor agonism appears to be the core. GIP may or may not be important. We had the SURPASS CVOT trial, which was just presented. We are still analyzing the details for that trial, and we hope to do that better.
Okay.
There are at least 70 new molecules which are going to be available.
So what
the Chinese appear to have hit it out of the park.
We are sharing our experience that GIP and GLP receptor agonist is more effective, as we have got the molecule available now in trials, and weight loss is more than what we have with semaglutide. The other thing is that sarcopenia, which is not addressed in most of these trials, that is also very relevant when we are using, and that should also be considered while we are using.
So if you look at the timeline of both these companies, both Eli Lilly as well as...
They are also in the trials, they have not mentioned about...
No. The companies are seized of this problem. That is why bimagrumab and other drugs were postulated to come in. But now this sarcopenia has been sarcopenia, NION, GI symptoms. These were some of and the problem that there is lack of legacy effect. So these are the 4 major challenges with this
another
therapy.
Important thing they have not looked into is the fat distribution after therapy, because it is the visceral fat that is more important. Many people are not obese, but metabolically they are obese. Many people are obese, but metabolically they are not obese. So these things have not been addressed.
So through that, because it is very difficult to do that in a population, weight is a very simplistic thing. If you read Lancet last year, there was definition of obesity was a major thing. I'm sure that Dr. Nita is going to address that between whether we are going to use BMI alone or we are going to use. I don't use BMI. I use BRI, and visceral adiposity. Visceral adiposity to me is very important. The thin fat Indian may be metabolically obese, but may look very thin. So the thinnest amongst us may have maximum visceral fat. But for that, there is no approval because for studying that, you need to have a cohort which is like that. So over to you, sir.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Nita Gandhi Farohi. very personal friend of mine, and she's a physician scientist at University of Cambridge, UK. She is head of nutrition and health research program focused on nutrition, metabolism, obesity, and cardiometabolic disease. Actually, her research defines a link between the nutrition, healthy aging, and multi-morbidity, and informs strategies for disease prevention in diverse ethnic and global population. Professor Faroui's research has generated more than 375 publications and more than 155,000 citations and H-index of 135. She is a commissioner of Eat Lancet Commission and serves on health-related committees, including currently as co-chair of World Health Organization Dietary Guideline Development Group. She is one of the leading figures in the Europe and has worked extensively on the multi-ethnic differences in nutrition. And she's the right person to speak out on obesity in Asia, Europe, and in pertaining to India. Over to Dr. Neeta. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, and thank you for that kind introduction. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person, but it's very exciting to join you. So I'm going to talk about what I've just been asked to do, which is to address how do we address the challenge of obesity in South Asians and particularly in India. I have no conflicts of interest to declare, and in the sorts of work that I do, I think that's quite important to be clear about. So in this brief space of time, I'm going to cover three things. Firstly, what is the problem that we are concerned about? And I'm going to speak from the perspective of cardiometabolic disease, relevant to today's conference. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the scale of the obesity challenge, and then look to what some of the causes are and what, therefore, the solutions are. So on that first topic, the problem. So the journey for this in my own research began several years ago, more than 2 decades ago, actually, where I wanted to understand the links between obesity and particularly body composition in relation to the higher cardiometabolic risk, both the higher prevalence of diabetes and cardiovascular disease in South Asians. And there were many lessons to be learned from looking at ethnic differences between immigrant South Asians in the UK compared with the white Europeans within the UK itself. And on the left is a little picture of the PhD that I produced from this work. So what did we and then others subsequently find? Well, we found that the prevalence of type 2 diabetes is some 4 to 5-fold higher in men and in women. This was the Southall study and the Brent study. We also looked at African Caribbeans. South Asians are marked here in the maroon color. Then later, some years forward, we also then had accrued enough events to study the incidence, new onset of diabetes. And again, in men and in women, we found that there was a massively elevated incidence of type 2 diabetes. The Indian Asians had the highest across the three ethnic groups. So this is the Europeans at the bottom here, African Caribbeans in the middle. And in women, a similar pattern of greater cumulative incidence of diabetes. Now, what about cardiovascular disease? So we looked at both coronary heart disease, myocardial infarction, as well as stroke. I'm showing you here only the data for CHD incidence. And here we looked at people without diabetes at baseline, as well as people with diabetes at baseline. And we found that in both instances, the incidence of CHD, new onset coronary heart disease, was some 2.5-fold greater in South Asians. Here you can see for people without diabetes and those with diabetes. So whichever way we look at it, the risk and incidence is higher in South Asians. Then I got very interested in the link with obesity. And what we were the first actually globally to publish on looking at the prospective evidence for the link between incidence of type 2 diabetes and adiposity. And here on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the results for the association with body mass index. And if you look here, at the BMI of 30, which is the cut point from the WHO and used universally for obesity, the incidence rate of close to 20 per 1,000 person years was achieved in South Asians, shown here in this red line. This is the line of incidence of South Asians. It was achieved at about just over 25 units. So there was a gap of about 4.5 BMI units at which South Asians developed type 2 diabetes at a lower BMI and at a younger age. Now, we also did this for waist circumference, and there was reference just made to whether BMI is an adequate measure, and waist circumference is a marker of central adiposity. Now, this work was actually picked up by the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence in the UK, and I was asked to provide evidence for it. And this had a policy impact because this plus other work and other evidence then contributed to setting lower thresholds for adiposity for various interventions by ethnicity in the UK. And that was quite an important policy impact. Now, others have gone on to also then look at this in larger cohorts. This was an analysis, but this was cross-sectional, not prospective like the one I showed you, in the UK Biobank with close to 500,000 people. This was the work of Naveed Sattar and others. And here they've looked at waist circumference and prevalence of diabetes. And again, using a similar approach as we did. So this is 102 centimeters cutoff, which is used in white Europeans across the world. And the same prevalence is achieved in South Asians at a waist circumference of just close to 80 centimeters, which is around 30 to 31 inches. So that's a massive difference at where risk is occurring. Lower adiposity, both generalized and central. So from this, of course, we've just heard about the thin fat Indian, the thin fat South Asian, thin on the outside and fat on the inside with the visceral adiposity. And in fact, both in the UK and in the UK, both in UK and India, there have been hypotheses put forward for why and how this happens. And essentially, the South Asian phenotype has at its core metabolically adverse body fat distribution. So South Asians have higher percent fat mass, higher percent body fat. They have lower lean mass, lower capacity for subcutaneous fat storage, and other things that go with it. And there is a greater proportion of visceral fat and greater ectopic fat. Higher liver fat is now well described in South Asians compared to most other ethnic groups. And this then leads to a cascade of metabolic disturbances. Now, these hypotheses have also been tested subsequently. I haven't got to show you that data, but there is some nice data from Glasgow recently where men of similar weight were put onto a diet that would increase the weight by 5 to 7% of body weight by overfeeding. And in South Asians, the metabolic dysregulation was massively higher than in the white matched men. Okay, so then I want to move on to the scale of the problem, the scale of obesity. Very recently, just earlier, about a month or so ago, there was this report published in The Lancet showing the global levels of adiposity based on the body mass index here in this case, and overweight and obesity defined with a cutoff of 25. With that, the top 3 countries for the highest numbers, the highest burden of obesity were China, India, and the US. India with 180 million people with a BMI above 25. Now, this is likely to be an underestimate because I've just shown you that the cut points for South Asians are actually lower at which risk occurs. So if this was shifted to around 23.5 for overweight, of course, this number would be much higher. Now, the projections are that by 2050, India will have close to 450 million people with a BMI above 25. That will be 1/3 of India's projected adult population at that time. This is colossal. So Closer to home, some of the studies that have informed those estimates, I'll show you two. Both were published in 2023. One is the National Family Health Survey-based data, and the other is the ICMR INDIAB data conducted by our very good friends and colleagues in Chennai, Anjana, Ranjit Mohan, and others. So with the NFHS, this was a large sample of more than 745,000 people. What you see here is that BMI more than 25, 23% of women and 22% of men crossed that line. So roughly similar, but women higher slightly. But when it comes to waist circumference, and note here the cutoff is 94 centimeters in men, 18 women, a staggering 40% in this large sample of women have abdominal obesity. Men far lower, which was a surprise actually when I read this. In the ICMR study, mean age is 43, about 113,000 people, and here note the urban-rural difference. That's what I wanted to point out. And here the cutoff was 80 centimeter in women, same as above, but lower threshold, close to what we've produced from the UK as being relevant for South Asians. So in urban areas, waist circumference, around 52% of people have that. So this is pretty serious stuff. And of course, we used to, in the past, have some sort of a status symbol, a sign of affluence. And this is an article very recently, this year, from the BBC, talking about this now being the silent killer. So from the Chennai-based lead on the ICMR study, for generalized obesity with BMI above 25, this is what the map of India looks like. So overall, there is some glimmerings of hope with some of these green and yellow amber colors. But once we look at urban areas, pretty much all of India has more than 25% of the population affected. In rural areas, the trend will be, unfortunately, towards this all red. And this is for abdominal obesity, again showing the map of India overall. Not a pretty picture in terms of the distribution in urban areas, and rural areas very much catching up wherever you look. And what is the cost of this? Well, so India is shown here in this dark line. The others are Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka down here, and then United Kingdom for comparison is what I've shown you here. At the moment, in 2025, our cost in India is well above other South Asian countries. The cost of managing obesity, of course, our population size is bigger. But look at what is happening. We are crossing over, and by 2050, 2060, we will be crippled by this if something is not done. This is untenable. The cost is into close to 800 billion US dollars. Okay, now I want to turn to the third and final part of what I want to say. And that is really the all-important. What are the modifiable causes? Yes, we can look to whether there are genetic differences. We can look at epigenetic. We can look at biology. All of those are important in us trying to understand the pathophysiology. And of course, with coming up with the right therapies, the drugs, etc. But what are the modifiable causes and solutions? So no surprise there. The key factors are the food we eat and whether we're physically active or inactive. Of course, drug therapies, will have been and will be covered a lot within this conference and immediately after my talk. And affecting that also are social factors, our education, our level of knowledge, our understanding, occupation, income, our religion, our culture. All of this impacts on how we engage with these modifiable factors. And then, of course, there are wider determinants, the environmental factors, where the individual level, just telling people what to do, will not cut it, and we need government actions. So diet is a modifiable factor. I have not got time to go into all the details of specific factors, but if I was to cut it down, this was a review article I wrote in Diabetologia just 2 years ago or 18 months ago. And distilled down information is that there are many different strategies for the prevention of weight gain, for weight loss, as well as for weight maintenance. And broadly speaking, if we look at nutrients, we have played off low-fat diets versus low-carb diets a lot. But effectively, if you can stick to either regime, they do work. It's what suits you, what suits your pocket, what suits your acceptability. There's loads of evidence, and I've sat on national committees in the UK, for example, appraising low carb or very low carb or ketogenic diets for the management of diabetes or for its remission. And the evidence is that whether you cut calories or you go for low carb or you go for low fat, all of them do work, but sustaining them is the biggest challenge. But what's even more important is when we make our food, when we purchase the food to cook, it's not nutrients we're buying. It's not nutrients we're cooking per se. It's the foods that we eat, and it's the overall dietary patterns within which we eat them that dictates what the proportion of these nutrients is. And of course, I haven't mentioned protein at all, but within the isocaloric diet framework, when one nutrient is reduced, the other one is increased, and vice versa within a fixed energy intake. Now, for calorie intake, of course, there is fantastic work on the remission of type 2 diabetes, and at the center of it is weight loss, and that work was done in the DIRECT trial. And we also have evidence now from Glasgow of a trial where in South Asians, the same regimen was given, and in fact, it was more effective than in white Europeans. So what about some data from India then? Because I spoke in general terms. Well, people are people, and diet, what works more or less in the West also works in India, but there's some specific nuances in India and within South Asia. So this is some older data from Chennai, when they did the Chennai urban-rural epidemiology study. And very interesting patterns here. So refined cereal intake constituted close to 50% of total energy intake. But if you look at fruits, vegetables, and whole cereals and millets, that was a woefully low amount. And this remains a challenge today. So very recently, the same group has published in Nature Medicine describing the dietary profiles and associated metabolic risk. This was just published about a month ago, so this is hot off the plate. And I won't have time to show you everything, but just one, again, on carbohydrate intake here. This is showing the various regions of India, and then it goes into each of those regions in detail. And here you can see the total carbohydrate intake, refined cereals intake in red, the milled whole grains intake in green, and added sugars in blue. And all I want to point out is that refined carbohydrate intake remains very high. And if you look at the northeastern region, it's close to 52% of the diet and variations thereof. Ultra-processed foods. I could not do the talk today without bringing this in. Ultra-processed foods have become all-pervasive in our diets globally, driven by global urbanization and big corporations and transnationals. And we recently published this paper in the Lancet region in South Asia. My PhD student Divya published this. And we quantified the regional variation of ultra-processed food consumption. We also looked at what are the drivers of ultra-processed food consumption. And we did this in 4 countries. For this sample, we had over 65,000 people. And just this week, on the 21st of November, some of you may know that there was a Lancet series published on ultra-processed food intake. And what this shows is that while currently India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, marked here in these red circles, have relatively lower proportion of consumption or sales per capita, but look at the growth of sales. It is rocketing in India. 150% increase in the sales of ultra-processed foods in India. So we are sitting on a time bomb of ultra-processed foods, which we know from a lot of different research, including my own research, are linked with obesity and with chronic diseases, not NCDs. So finally, very briefly, I just want to touch upon physical activity. Indians, unfortunately, have very insufficient physical activity. This is a comparison done across several countries in Asia, and India win the league table for being at the bottom of the pile, as it were, for around 50% of us not taking enough physical activity. And this is a very modest amount of physical activity of 150 minutes per week, as per the WHO. This is data again from my colleagues in Chennai, and others, of course, in Delhi, Lucknow, etc., have also published such findings. And if you look at the urban and rural inactive, 72% are inactive in urban areas. And highly active is woefully low, 3%, according to this fairly large survey. Now, let's look at the wider determinants. So we can tell people, oh, you must go away and exercise, you must eat healthy food. But what's the reality? Well, this is how I cycle to work. I have a helmet, I feel safe because the cars are on the other side. I was recently in Lucknow, and unfortunately, we don't have those safety nets. And trying to walk across streets, I've tried to cross streets like this. Perhaps I've lost the ability, but I need help often. And this was a very nice analysis done by a colleague who came to work with us in Cambridge, Rahul. He wrote this about gender gap in mobility outside the home. Women are getting far less exercise than men because of what our cities and towns often look like and the safety. As for diet, well, this is just one feature of wider determinants, affordability. In India, close to 60% of people cannot afford a healthy diet. So we can tell them all we want. Yes, the rich can afford it, but the vast majority cannot. And I won't go into all the details, but there are so many things that shape what we eat and how much physical activity we do. So for food, it's the availability, accessibility. Advertising has a huge impact. And our TV screens and the phones we hold in our hands do a lot of advertising. And there are market forces. And just telling people what to do will not be enough. We need very serious government policies to make a dent in what I've just shown you as the challenge. And of course, I want to mention that weight loss therapies, we've just been talking about GLPs and GIPs, RAs. Of course, they're a potential game changer for obesity management, but there are many, many, many caveats. Eligibility, side effects, what about sarcopenia and loss of lean mass as well as fat mass, cost and equity issues. In the UK, we cannot give this to everyone eligible because we would be absolutely bankrupt. Our NHS will go bankrupt. So how do we ensure equity, and how do we go for it? And is nutrition still relevant within this paradigm with weight loss therapies? Yes, absolutely, and hugely, because quality of food will still matter even if your appetite is suppressed. You need to eat healthily. So some take-home messages there, which I will not read out. I hope what I've said is clear, but in the interest of time, I think we have a big challenge ahead, and we have many, many solutions at hand, but we need both individual level and government and policy level action to achieve them. And I'd like to leave with thanking my colleagues, in particular Anjana and Naveed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neeta, for wonderfully highlighting the aspect of obesity in our country and how are you going to deal with it in the next 20 to 30 years. We are practically sitting on a volcano now, and majority of things can be rectified by timely action. Any comments or questions you can ask from Neeta? Neeta,
shall I stop sharing? Shall I stop sharing?
Sorry?
Yes.
Shall I stop sharing my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Sushi?
Yeah.
CG sir.
Professor Agrawal, CG Agrawal, sir, your comments.
There is one point. Health study. The South Asians are only 17% obese, while white men are 42%, black men are 50% obese. So is there a difference between South Hall and South Asians in America?
No, South Asians is the thin fat challenge, where for a matched BMI, there is more percent body fat and greater visceral fat and less lean fat and more liver fat. So in terms of the percentage of people who are obese, you're absolutely right. So in the US, it's in the UK, the percent of people whose BMI above 25 is around 65% of people, actually. It's huge. In India, that is still at around under 20%, but that is rapidly increasing. The challenge, of course, is that 25 cutoff or the 30 cutoff doesn't really apply to South Asians. We need to bring it much lower because our metabolic risk is way higher, as endless studies have shown.
Singh?
The ICMR, all these guidelines for Southeast Asians, we are following from last 15-20 years that BMI instead of 25 should be 23 for our population, and the waist ratio instead of 100 in Western, 19 males and 18 females. So what Nita is saying, the basis of those guidelines she has told us, re-emphasizing that we may not look at obese, but most of us are obese either by weight or by abdominal circumference.
Absolutely.
Dr. Singh?
I think it was a very stimulating talk, and thank you very much for it, Dr. Nita. Even in Indian households, it is a matter of great challenge because no two households have similar food. Two sisters who go into different families actually have different foods. So people eat according to comfort and their choices. They don't necessarily eat according to a pattern. Yet, as a population, we have so many commonalities. Look at the Northeastern diet. Look at the South Indian diet. Look at the North Indian diet. They're completely different. But at the same time, we have some phenotypes which are common. Personally, I think the definition of obesity probably needs to come away from the stigmatization and the fat shaming into the sphere of being clinically and metabolically relevant. So thereby it will be established more as a disease rather than as a social stigma. The second thing which I feel is that because you understand that all diets are different, and the common result is the same, even the small hormones of the gut act for very short intervals, and we have luminary endocrinologists here who will attest to that. So it's very difficult to estimate them. It's common. And here is something which I'm going to give you food for thought is actually so we should do much more gut microbiome analyses to find out why is it that we are having a common clinical phenotype. And I think that's where we might get some answers. I had this crazy conversation a week ago with a friend of mine who actually said that he's trying to do a startup. And he wanted me to sign an NDA. I said, I don't sign NDAs just like this. So he says, I'm doing a startup which is actually going to estimate the smell in the to determine how you eat the next day. So I think there are some innovative nudges. We had a discussion yesterday, even for building nudges as to how we regulate our dietary intake and how we make it more appropriate. So I would love to hear your comments on that. I stopped using BMI a long time ago. I use a little more BRI, but I use a very simple weight related formula, height in centimeters less 100, because that as far as weight is concerned gives me a clear indication. And then I look at maybe the waist, and occasionally it's very difficult to estimate visceral fat. At least in our context, because for every investigation we do, there is a payment by the patient. So he's not going to do it to satisfy our research urges. He would undergo that if it was meaningfully going to impact his or her treatment. So we have devised. I really want to know whether these body mass analysis equipment which are being sold, whether they could have any relevance for this. So I know I've asked you a couple of confusing issues, but if you could, enlighten us on these.
Okay, thank you for the comments. Very extensive. I think, one could easily take half an hour to answer that, but I won't. You raised a number of issues. One of them is about the diversity of the diets, even within the same family members. That is absolutely true. And of course, the diversity of India. So the package of healthy dietary patterns come in many, many different forms. So if one was to say, for instance, the Mediterranean diet or Mediterranean type diet has been shown to have major cardiovascular benefits, and there's randomized controlled trial evidence for that. That doesn't mean everyone has to eat exactly how people in Crete and Greece eat. It's how do you adapt that to India? How do you adapt that to Sri Lanka and so on? And so basically diets need to be culturally relevant and acceptable to the family. That's the first principle. In terms of your point about the gut microbiome and the impact of diet on that, there's a huge amount of work already ongoing on that, and we collaborate with some colleagues. There's a whole center for gut microbiome research that we work with, and it is one of the pathways or one of the biological mechanisms through which the metabolic processes happen. So the link, what is it about diet and then all these cancers and cardiometabolic disease and other health outcomes? What's in between? What's in that black box? Well, gut microbiome is hugely important, but it is one pathway. There are other things going on as well, such as inflammatory processes and the impact on lipids and a whole host of other things, sodium levels, phytochemicals. So diet is immensely complex, and there are many different pathways that we are now beginning to understand. And you're right, gut microbiome is important. In broad and simple terms, without overcomplicating it, I think people just need to have more fermented dairy products. People need to have more fermented products. And each of the cuisines have options that improve probiotics naturally. So that's on the gut microbiome, indeed an important pathway. Lastly, your point about BMI, whether that is a good measure and whether one should go for these new, tools that are now available. We've been this is not a new debate. We've been debating this for a while, and essentially, what the concept that I sign up to a lot is what's called the personal fat threshold. So yes, BMI is a crude marker, and to a certain extent, even the waist circumference or visceral fat is a marker. But it all depends on what your own personal starting point is. Your own personal fat threshold is that when you cross it, you get metabolic disease. So some people may put on 10 kilos and not have the same impact as someone else who may put on 5 kilos and get those impacts. So this is a concept that's been discussed very nicely by Roy Taylor, who was also my teacher when I was a medical student. He was my consultant